Everybody, nice to be here and see you all at the tail end of the semester. My name is Joost Bonsen. I've been at MIT roughly as long as the Media Lab has been in existence, starting as a freshman, coming from Silicon Valley to here to do electrical engineering with a biomedical bent. And what I ended up mostly getting involved in is the world of entrepreneurship. And so the stuff that I've done has been starting and building some big fraction of what's today's MIT venture ecology. And that means dozens of classes, starting a half dozen different clubs, helping build what's become the Trust Center for Entrepreneurship, co-founding the Gotham Center for Development and Entrepreneurship. So that's the bulk. And that also means, since then, having been a lecturer at the Media Lab, what I've mostly done are venture-oriented classes, including mostly with Media Lab faculty, but usually cross-listed between business school, architecture, engineering, and more, including a class with Kent, exploring the idea of urban ventures. What are the business opportunities implicit in the kinds of things that are being developed? So from our point of view, the fact that these ideas and prototypes and stuff have commercial usefulness is actually a good thing. But there's clearly pitfalls. Right? There's many products which, in retrospect, people regret developing. Yeah, that's another line of reasoning, which especially comes up in the second set of classes that I do, which is all around using science fiction as a form of future exploration. So sci-fab is about reading and viewing fictional future worlds or alternative worlds and being inspired to prototype things, and vice versa, looking at the world of what's being made in labs and imagining how our future cities, our future places, our future planets might be. But most relevant to this session is the fact that together with Kent, we've co-taught and or been part of a half dozen different future places. And changing places is a lovely name, strategically ambiguous, has multiple meanings, as do many of the titles of our classes, which were one way or another about creative ways of rethinking how we could and should live in the places of tomorrow. And in particular, this innovation hubs, creative places, and future Kendall classes are what relevant for today, because I wanted to talk about this super theme of innovation epicenters with us as a lab, MIT as a campus, and Kendall Square as a neighborhood, as illustrations, as live case studies of this idea that innovation epicenters are places that are unusually attractive to and supportive of creative talent with big goals and ambitions. They come to places and they do better being there and being together than they would otherwise be apart. So, where are we? Well, flying into Logan, you will look north and see us. The MIT campus is, 60-something hectares on the northern shore of the Charles, pointing northwest in the direction of Harvard. And we're here, right, in the Media Lab on this campus. And the Kendall Square zone is this square kilometer or so, mostly to the northeast of campus, although the edges have blurred over the years, but roughly it's that zone to the northeast. So that's today's subject matter. And I want to start with the lab. So the young Nicholas Negroponte graduated in the 60s in architecture and ended up running a group called ArcMac, Architecture Machine. He wrote a vision book, which is amazing. It's digitally available online. The Architecture Machine, he wrote in 1970. And it's a good example of a strategically ambiguous name. The Media Lab is chock full of these. Every single PI's group is intended to be a two-word combination that claims territory and differentiates from others, but is also fuzzy enough to be reinventable. And what is an architecture machine? Is it a machine for living in? Is it a machine to help architects design? Is it a replacement for the architect as designer? I think the answer is yes, right? It's all of those. And Nicholas, in his early thinking, dedicated the book to the first machine that could appreciate the gesture. He was thinking from the very beginning that the field of architecture, historically dominated by the classic static tools, pencil, paper, so forth, would really need to embrace the world of artificial intelligence. Now, it turns out the then president, Jerry Wiesner, was about to retire and would often cross paths with Nicholas's architecture machine group. It's a great place to bring visitors to show demos. And Jerry lamented that in his retirement there wouldn't be a home for somebody who'd run MIT but wanted to go back to research. And I think Nicholas was being smart when he said, "I will help you build our future lab if you will help me raise the money to make it happen." And they did, using this sales pitch, that historically separate worlds that were analog, the world of content creation and deployment, the world of communications, and the world of computing, were then separate but would converge. And we would invent that converged future as a new lab. And they picked the term media as, again, strategic ambiguity, because none of the engineers were offended if somebody claimed media as territory to do research in. And Nicholas, of course, thought the invention of future media, namely the stuff that's between us, ourselves, and each other, and our future virtual and physical worlds, that stuff is what we in this lab would be researching. And that's more or less what happened. Built this IMP building, dedicated in 1985, and then later added the 2009 or so, Fumihiko Maki designed a new expansion complex. Here it is from the other point of view in a recent photograph. As an important term, a salon de refugiés. They wanted a space for people who didn't otherwise have a home. So Marvin Minsky of AI fame was no longer interested in his old AI lab, wanted a new home. Seymour Papert, who was about learning and tools for creativity, didn't have a school of education at MIT. You had artists and movie makers and others who had no natural home within the 5 schools of the Institute. And so this was a place that absorbed them and hired new people who were similarly had a hard time finding a home. Yeah. So the early projects out of Architecture Machine Group, like the gestural interface, put that there, this Aspen map, which was essentially today we'd recognize in Google Street View, and many other projects were things that hearkened to the future and were the stuff that inspired the raising of money to make the Media Lab, which invented ever more such demos. I've left these in the slide deck so you can later review whatever you care about, if you care about them, but I won't let them play in totality here, just to whet your appetite about how much richness there is to follow up on. The lab leaders themselves, plus smart observers like Stu Brand, have been embedded here, have worked here, have written about their experiences. This is a rich tapestry of various people's opinions about what works and what doesn't about the lab. I simply want to say that they don't all agree with each other by a long shot, and they've changed their mind about their opinions in retrospect. But what fundamentally has happened here is that the original founding mission of convergence was accomplished within a decade of 1985. And so by the mid-90s, Blaise had already started adjusting its mission to no longer worrying about digitization and convergence only, and coding, but rather about embedding intelligence into things. And the things that think movement, what we today commercially think of as maybe Internet of Things, that emerged. And so by the mid-90s, you had lots of work on wearables. This is the Borg Lab Wearables Gang. This was a multi-group initiative, actually largely led by the students, to build shared infrastructure for putting computers on themselves and walking around with displays in their glasses. And now this is 1995. So you had mobile phones, but you had nothing like a smartphone of the Apple variety, which emerged only in the early 2000s. So these Borgs, these wearables, were seeing that war and computing vision. You also had the emergence of fab labs, right? Connecting the making of physical stuff, atoms, and embedding the stuff the lab was born with, bits, and weaving those two ever more together. To the point where today, the latest movement is all about growing, both macro and micro, and doing wetware. So the lab just upstairs is Chanon's work to make implantables, or body-conformable wearables, or things that are more physiometric than they are cognitive or intellectually oriented. The lab has had lots of outside observers come in and survey the technologies. I don't want to take time today to do that. You all can go onto the website and see the 24 different research groups and the hundreds of resulting projects, including the most visible and so forth. I simply want to point out that so much of the work that was driven by these waves, the coding and digitization wave, the making and fabrication of hardware wave, and most recently the growing bio and life science wave, have also had an interesting consequence in the following. In the world of all things children, turns out the kids' uses of the same set of tools have led to some of the most widespread deployments. So for instance, the ultimate thing that thinks is the Lego Mindstorms, where you've got kid programmable computer embedded into stuff of Lego so they can make their own programmable robots, their own programmable monsters. And projects like Topobo in the Tangible Media Group are the same, only it's even easier to program. You show the robot what to do. It's a cobot. Only cobots today are industrially a billion-dollar industry. Only here they were done first as toys for kids. And that movement started with founding Media Lab professor Seymour Papert with his Mindstorms book, Lego the company and sponsor of the lab, turning the name and the Lifelong Kindergarten project on programmable bricks into a multi-million unit best-selling product line, which drove the first robotics Lego League, among other things. Nonprofit spin-offs like the One Laptop Per Child, book written by another Media Lab director on learning to change the world, spinning that out, trying to make it successful, having lots of failures along the way, but nevertheless persisting, reacting to the skepticism with the Curious Learning spinoff.org, the Computer Clubhouse Network. Today, think of it as the Creativity Clubhouse, because the scarce resource is no longer the laptops and the computers that the kids didn't have access to then. Now it's other stuff, it's places to be creative. You've got students who went on to run in the school system of entire countries, like David Senge. You've got lots and lots of thinking about how the stuff that's invented here and useful first for adults be in fact be useful first for children, and adults can learn from their work. Among the latest of these efforts is David Kong's work on community biotech, democratizing understanding of DNA, of wetware, of biology as code, as something programmable, and something that everybody ought to know about. Well, the core ethos then of the place is you see what's coming first by inventing it. Here, the wearables gang are sitting on the steps of the Wiesner building, this building, but just out front along Ames Street, with Professor Sandy Penland at the time. He'd been a vision researcher, but his students, led by Thad Starner, pushed for putting vision ability onto the body. So instead of having it be in physical spaces where you had cameras propped, as we have here, the cameras would be on us and with us, and the computing would also be there. And we would interface these things, these wearables, privately through displays. This private eye is actually a product of a humanities alum from MIT, Alan Becker's reflection technologies. And Thad used these, hacking a pair of safety glasses to have the display embedded. And then he adopted the first of the micro-optical devices, which were later absorbed by Google to make glass. So this is an example of an academic thing that was born of mostly student-driven interest, but supported by research funded by the lab. And it ended up becoming a failed spin-off product. You could argue that Google Glass and the glass hole movement was actually a fizzle. But we'll see, because it's one of those projects that a decade later, people are more comfortable with and used to. And so watch what happens with Meta's collaboration with Ray-Ban on very normal-ish looking pairs of glasses that have exactly the same functionality in them that these Borgs, these wearables prototypers, had in the mid-1990s. Yeah, By contrast to the wearables movement, there was a rival initiative, the ubiquitous people, and there are many flavors of that, but perhaps my favorite is the least widely deployed but best idea of the lab, in my opinion, ever, namely the I/O bulb, John Unterkoffler's attempt to create affordable luminous rooms where every surface in a place could be computer-controlled pixelation. Every surface is a display if you have affordable light bulb, projector, camera combinations that you can deploy everywhere. And he called it the I/O bulb. This is his 1999 doctoral thesis. And if you think about stuff you've certainly seen from the City Science Lab, the Cityscope, where they're projecting onto Lego models and they have cameras to detect movement in those models. Well, that's inspired by a long thread started by Unterkoffler. Here he is at his TED Talk describing the gestural interface thinking that I/O bulbs enable for free. He was the one who advised Spielberg in the movie Minority Report on Tom Cruise's gestural interface. That was all fake FX in the movie, but he built it for real. A different group, Patty Maas's fluid interface, had Natan Linder actually prototyping this idea that Unterkoffler could only speculate about, because in the 1990s, the projectors were huge, bulky boxes, cameras ditto. All the component elements were too large to shrink into the size of a bulb. But here, Natan did it. The lamp is robotic, but the important part is the bulb, which does applications like project onto surfaces, whatever you want. Now, what's lovely about this is it's another part of the ethos of the lab, the idea that people riff off of each other's product ideas. The best of the riffs are the apps built on top of smart bulbs, like this never-ending play machine, which a bunch of students did for fun in a class project where you had to build a demo. This was 2 kids with teleplay spaces. A kid in one location would be interacting with physical stuff, have a camera projector combination above their table, and interact with another kid, their Skype pal, if you will, somewhere else on the planet, and they'd be interacting with each other. So the never-ending play machine or never-ending drawing machine was an illustration, a killer exemplar app on this future device, the smart bulb. Well, there are many of those, and today I don't want to emphasize all of them in detail, but rather to say that the most promising of these from a commercial point of view, as well as from a nonprofit point of view, get taken beyond the lab when people graduate, most often, but also absorbed by the member companies that are paying the bills. So all things robotics have led to half dozen different spin-offs, including failures like Jibo, Cynthia Brazil's effort to make a home robot who was outcompeted by Amazon's Alexa. Here you have the very early prototype of the RoboWheel functionality on a city car, the stuff of the Smart Cities group that was half predecessor to what's today's City Science group. That was commercialized several different ways, all interesting unto themselves, but they're 2 example core thema of a pattern of many themes within the lab. There's lots of ideation in this pipeline, so to speak. This is a crude metaphor for what happens here. Many, many, many ideas, some of which get winnowed, and the best and most intriguing get prototyped and iterated upon and improved. And then, interestingly, more and more are being deployed and tested in living labs, of which Place Labs is an example. But there are today a dozen different physical locations of various scales at which stuff is tested. Persuasive electric vehicles being tested on campuses, etc., at scale. And that's how you know you're really onto something, if it responds, if the real world responds well to it, or helps you improve it. And finally, this is all pre-commercial. It crosses a red line, has to go beyond the walls of the Institute, and become some sort of spin-off or product line that a company or somebody else absorbs. And today, for the last 5+ years, a little bit more, we've had an investment fund that helps pay the bills for those who desire commercializing what they're doing. And yeah, there are lots of those examples. Here's just a handful of the logos from historic Media Lab spinoffs. Just to note that not all are .coms. Something like OLPC is a .org. And not all are startups. Something like Mindstorms is an entrepreneurial commercialization of a big idea. But almost all the rest are one way or another efforts to take what was a seed kernel of an idea here at the lab and then turn it into something I could actually sell in the real world. Econest has since been bought by Spotify, for instance. This is Spotify's personalization core engine. And the music researchers who spun out to do this are doing it again. Harmonics is what led to Guitar Hero, rock band. And the co-founder of that, Ron Agozi, is now back at MIT. He's a professor of the practice in the music group, running a new initiative. So look, the 24-ish Media Lab groups are all part of the larger lab. And there's more complexity there. There's initiatives and cross collaborations and things beyond the lab. But to first approximation, these 24 form roughly 2.5% to 3% of all of MIT via the School of Architecture and Planning, which is the oldest in the nation. Older than everybody else. Lots of interesting alums from architecture. The founders of Skidmore, Owens & Merrill, the designer of Rockefeller Plaza, I.M. Pei, designer of this building, and three others at MIT, all alums from our school here, all part of the Institute, which is 1,000 faculty, more or less, 13 or so thousand students, 12,000 students, and then a whole host of staff, researchers, postdocs, you name it, roughly 20,000 people, so a small city. Yeah, how did that happen? Well, this guy, William Barton Rogers, had been a faculty member at University of Virginia for a few decades, but he had a new idea, and he found it hard to do there. But he married a Bostonian woman of means, and they moved up here. And for a decade plus, he had this dream of a new kind of way of teaching and bringing students together to be creative in learning skills that are relevant to a fast industrializing and growing economy, something different from the classic religious preacher colleges that dominated the Ivy League of the time and still do in their own way. His manifesto was ultimately approved by the powers that be in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts 2 days before the American Civil War. Paused the creation of MIT for another 4 years, fighting North versus South. Yeah, so in 1865, the place opened, and this is now in Back Bay of Boston. This is the Rogers Building. It was on the map, the plan of campus, this middle building in a block. If you look at Google today, you'll see it's where Nordstrom's is, in a much bigger building. It's a totally different structure. But what still exists is the old Museum of Society of Arts. It was Louis of Boston for many years. Here the point is, this is the John Hancock Tower. So if you look south across the river and you see the John Hancock, 2 blocks away is where MIT started and was until the 19-teens. Sit down. What already started under Rogers and was continued by his successors and their successors, and I think continues through today, is this trifecta, this troika of what MIT does as an organization. And the formal stuff, the roughly $1 billion worth of annual research per year, is run by mostly professors in mostly labs and groups of various scales and degrees of collaboration. And it leads to publications, patents, and prototypes. And actually, people who are trained having done all that stuff. That's coming to all of them, though. Education is what we're doing here in the classroom, right? Following an a curriculum, including chosen electives, which this is, not required for anybody, but you do it because you're interested in it. And that leads you all, within your respective programs here at Harvard and elsewhere, to degrees and diplomas. And that's run through the departmental and school channels of the institution. Whereas most of the research is run in a cross-cutting fashion, the money flows in places like MIT through labs and centers that are largely the places where sponsorship of research happens and where the philanthropic support for research occurs. But this third piece, the extra curriculum, the X and REX, is beyond lab or class. It's what people do for fun on their own time. through clubs, teams, living groups often, for fun and professional development. And this is the stuff of entrepreneurship competitions, invention challenges, hackathons. This is where I spent the big fraction of my time as an undergrad and later grad student. Although I did do things like serve on the CUI's committee that oversaw Place Lab back at that time, which was a very interesting thing indeed, because it's a committee not equipped to deal with this wavefront of digital devices, spyware, and what do they mean? How much approval is possible when you're sucked into having your information scraped without you knowing about it or being able to consent? Very tough times, actually, to be a human studies institutional review board person. But that, too, is the kind of thing that students volunteer for as extracurriculars. So super important for learning, this trifecta. Now, Rogers, the founder of MIT, did something really important. If you build anything, a startup, school, whatever, you have to find a successor. And he did in Francis Amasa Walker, who was completely unlike Rogers. Rogers was a geologist, a natural scientist. Walker, on the other hand, was an economist. He had risen in the Civil War to be a brevet brigadier general, so he was a bit of a leader, an organizer. And he was actually most famous for having run the US Census in 1870, removing all sorts of politics and corruption from that process because he wanted an accurate finger on the pulse of the fast-growing country. And he pioneered the idea of visual atlases. So this is a heat map of economic activity. Wealth is what he called it in the rapidly growing US, right? As it was pushing out the natives and being the way the Americans were at that time. He documented it. Only here he had a problem. All the way in the late 1800s, he knew that they couldn't count the fast-growing population in the 10 years allocated by the US Constitution for the task. It had taken 8 years to do this 1870 census, and he was now worried, or he was in the middle of doing the 1880 census. In any case, the key point is that he tapped an MIT mechanical engineering faculty member named Hollerith. He said, if you have at solving this problem, and they knew each other because Hollerith had worked for Walker at the census. When Walker came to MIT, he had recruited Hollerith to join him. So this subject matter of accounting technology was in the air. Hollerith drew inspiration from the jacquard loom used in the then large Boston textile sector and created a counting machine using punch cards, just like the jacquard loom used, to account for people and their various properties, their qualities. Gender, economic activity, employment, number of children, all that. Now that, Hollerith decided to commercialize into a tabulating recording machine company, which merged with Peers to create the famous CTR, a three-letter acronym. Y'all know what this acronym stands for or what it is today? Yeah, no, because they changed their name a century ago to the much more memorable International Business Machines. Yeah, you see, Walker was one of, as a sidecar conversation, as his extracurricular, he and Hollerith ended up starting a business that we still have with us today. And Walker did something else, which I particularly like. He was friendly to the idea of peers learning from MIT what we were doing and how to also do it. And he, in fact, went with Frederick Law Olmsted, who you may know as the designer of Central Park, the Emerald Necklace to the south of us in Boston, of the big park in San Francisco. He went to the West Coast to work with a West Coast zillionaire on their new idea for a school. And that's why Walker, the intellectual architect, together with Olmsted, the physical landscape architect, are the co-founders of MIT's West Coast spinoff, Stanford University. Yes. Indeed, that is a peer school in many ways. At the time, some breakthroughs emerged. Right? MIT's first female student was Ellen Swallow, who later married a graduate from MIT's first class, Richards. She's amazing. She's the founder of the discipline of ecology. She created home economics. She started a chain of health food restaurants called the New England Kitchen. But she also helped found HUI, and she created a distance learning program for women who weren't being admitted to colleges. They're being discriminated against. So she's an extraordinary educator and multidisciplinary person. A few years after her, MIT's first African-American alumnus, Taylor, was an architect, our school. He later went on to co-found and build. He architected 80% of Tuskegee University. And he's the first alumnus to go overseas to found and build a college. He went to Liberia to create the Booker T. Washington Institute in the county in Liberia where a lot of rubber growing was occurring. So it's an ag and vocational school in Africa back in the 1920s, so a century ago. And look, all these logos represent universities that MIT people have helped start, either faculty, formally, top-down, engaging, such as these more recent initiatives in Abu Dhabi, Singapore, Russia, alums working on Pakistan's LUMS, Eugenio Garza Sada in civil engineering, studying Tec de Monterrey in the 1940s. He's an alum from the first class to graduate on this campus. Lawrence Burke, an architect, started a music college named after his son, Lee Burke, Berkeley. And Roger Babson donated his Wellesley estate to create a business school that's older than MIT's business school. And there's more. I just give you these as a sampler. And it almost didn't happen because this man, member of MIT's founding faculty, he was a chemist. He was later poached by Harvard University, the much older, bigger, wealthier, upriver neighbor, to be president of Harvard. And he tried to acquire MIT at least a handful of times. Think of this as hostile takeover. Huh? And he succeeded the last time he tried because this president, Pritchett, who took over after Walker passed away, Pritchett said yes to the deal. He convinced the trustees to agree. But he had a rebellion in the ranks because essentially nobody else agreed. So, long story, fast forward, he got a promotion out of the MIT presidency and had a new president come. This fellow, the first international, McLaurin, was a Scotsman from New Zealand, so a migrant twice over. And McLaurin had a different vision for the future. He realized that what MIT was doing was important, but it was running out of room in Back Bay, which was rapidly growing, and MIT was priced out. And yet, when he went to the townhouse of one of the trustees, a man named Stone, who had co-founded Stone and Webster, biggest engineering firm in Boston, he stood over there, looked north at what was then the flats, the landfill of the northern shore of the Charles River. Here you can see the already constructed Massachusetts Avenue and the Harvard Bridge, the Mass Ave Bridge. This curve is where later the entrance to the Infinite Corridor. This is where Building 7 is located today. So he stood over there and looked over here and had imagination. He recruited an alumnus architect named Bosworth to also have at this space. Here, by the way, it is from the roof of the now Massey Hall. For a long time, it was originally the Rivercourt Press Hotel. This is Amherst Street. This is Memorial Drive. This is Mass Ave heading up towards Harvard. And so, available land. Why? Because bankruptcy. The real estate company building this went out of business. Here's where MIT would come later on what was already then industrial land. And here's the dream. Bosworth had a sketch and a vision. There's where we would come later. Now here's how much was built in the beginning. So not bad, but the plan wasn't followed, except here. This is the not yet completed Lobby 7, Building 7. And not yet here, which was later filled in. But notice, you already have movement through Walker Memorial towards what MIT would later acquire. All this land further east towards Kendall Square. Now, this is in the 1920s. Lobby 7 was built in 1930, early Depression days. But they finished it and put in stone a short version of Rogers' ethos, his motto for MIT, or his longer mission statement: advancement and development of science and application to industry, the arts, agriculture, and commerce. So the business ties were there from day zero at MIT. Once again, too much to share in the short time here, so I leave these videos available for you to peruse at your leisure on the class surveying the history of the Institute and various others, the 150th of our birth, the 100th anniversary of our time on this campus. These are all cusp moments that were well thought of times to document the place. And the best source for more info on this is the MIT Press bookstore's long and almost comprehensive, as near as I can tell, summary listing of every book written anywhere, published by anybody, that has to do with some aspects of the history of MIT. So worth trawling should you be interested. But the punchline here is that this took people. And remember, the Innovation Epicenters theme is about where talent is disproportionately attracted to and supported. In the beginning, lean times, a couple dozen people per class. This burst here is Walker's doing. He quadrupled MIT's enrollment. This period is the last of MIT in Boston. We move in 1916. There's World War I, World War II. A little bit more. The blue is the undergraduate population, and notice it stabilizes right around World War II at right around 1,000 students. The faculty are in red. They go exponential pre and post World War II, but this is the period of Sputnik. So the panic, Americans fear the Soviet advances, start to pour money into educational institutions of science and technology bent. And that stabilizes in the 1970s at about 1,000 faculty, plus or minus 100 or so. Yeah? Notice the biggest growth. This green is graduate students, which go from being a third or less of the undergrad percentage to at least 1.5, twice the size of undergrads. And the upper part is postdocs. So that's the talent that's attracted here. And you know from the selectivity rates that there's far more demand than there's capacity. So MIT is admitting maybe 5 to 10% of the applicants. And today that's from 100 countries, all 50 states, and about 50-50 for undergrads, men and women, depending on the department. Some are more women, but roughly 50-50, and about 1/3, 2/3 for grads still, and about 1/5 to 3/4 for the faculty. Yeah, now, translating ideas from lab to life is what it means to be innovative. It's not enough to invent, you have to deploy, get things spread. And the Media Lab story I've told you a taste of, but there are others. The World War II Radiation Lab inspired dozens of startups and created the first interdisciplinary civilian lab, research lab for electronics, and more. The world of all things life sciences blossomed because of a commitment to molecular biology in the 1960s that led to spin-offs in the 1970s and 80s. Here from the licensing office is a couple key punchlines. In any given year, the number of spin-off companies is roughly 1 every 2 weeks. The cumulative total since the 1980s, and probably early 90s, is over 600 already spin-off companies formally licensing MIT technologies. There's an order of magnitude more from the alumni. And then also, disclosures received. This is interesting because it gives you a sense of the most optimistic number of inventions by the 1,000 or so faculty, 13,000 or so students. This is roughly 2 or 3 invention disclosures per workday at MIT, and it's only a subset of those that get patents applied for and so forth. And my specialization was the world of entrepreneurship here. It turns out Walker was the first scholar of this stuff. He thought the division between capitalists and laborers was insufficient. You needed somebody to help coordinate the laborers and raise the capital, and he called them entrepreneurs, for lack of a better word. Lots of early efforts, the first venture capital firm, the first industrial liaison program for any university, the founding of an alumni-oriented enterprise forum. The list goes on, including the building of more and more stuff at MIT. So this past quarter century is richer in infrastructure for entrepreneurship than everything done before combined. My own contribution was doing the first global census of startups, which is to say there are at least 4,000, and they employ at least 1 million people worldwide, and they have at least $250 billion of aggregate annual revenues. And there's roughly a doubling per decade of the number of MIT-related startups. Now, my Sloan colleagues have done it again, this research, with a different method. They extrapolate from a survey, which I don't really like, but nevertheless, it documents the sheer size of the entrepreneurial consequence of doing things. Actually, the study I ran was more general. It was founders, builders, and leaders. It was people who ran or grew anything for and nonprofit. But the bank, which published the results, chose to concentrate on just the entrepreneurs. And there are many of these companies. These logos represent just a tiny number, but notice entire industries born from research in labs 1 or 2 decades earlier, leading to these sectors in software, hardware, materials, bio, info, nano, food, consumer goods. And in fact, it feeds forward. So here's campus, the triangle shape roughly. East and west wings. On the east wing, if you zoom in here, these logos are mapped to the buildings that the founders chose to philanthropically support. That's why we have most of the names we have on the buildings. And I think it's also why most MIT students think of buildings as numbers, not as names. They just don't remember. The green building, is the Cecil Green who founded Texas Instruments. Or that building behind you all was named after Okawa, the leader of Sega, the video games business. And the list goes on, with the mystery donor, George Eastman, being the major donor of all things in the main group of buildings. When MIT first moved here, he was the one who financially made it possible. Even though he didn't have a direct connection, he was a philanthropist. And it's true that MIT is one of 3 privately run Merrill land grant universities, but it's the only land grant university that was done in an urban city center. And it was because of the land grant status that things are tricky, but nevertheless, we're here on the northern shore of the Charles River. And Kendall Square is our today neighbor, a vibrant place full of infotech, biotech, and other tech companies. And notice the red blotches. That's why Boston is the Athens of America. The red blotches are all the academic institutions that are our near neighbors. Yeah, we're close to a lot of really interesting people, and we're all collectively attracting talent like a magnet to Boston. Yeah, Kendall Square, however, is actually the story of various booms and busts. There was a period of time when this place was the world headquarters for making fire hose and rubberized clothing and AstroTurf. It was also where the dominant mode in the near neighborhood was candy making, today largely replaced by biotech startups. Polaroid, Harvard dropout Edwin Land founded this optics and photography business. And more recently, the waves of new stuff have been robotics or voice recognition and so forth. This plaque is on what was a railroad manufactory. It's where Watson sat when Bell made the first long-distance phone call on old telegraph lines. This is a National Historic Landmark. Yeah, because the booms and busts of Kendall Square and the fortunes of Institute alums are very much in sync with macro waves of new technologies, of economic growth and trauma. Right? There's a reason the land that we're on now was abandoned. It's because of the bankruptcy at the end of the 1990s. Big panic that led lots of people to lose their shirts and lots of companies to shut down. And that's been repeated over and over again. So I want to get you to imagine Kendall Square in the 1920s, so a century ago. Today it's booming. What was it a century ago? Answer, also booming. Only totally different kinds of technologies. The Red Line had just been completed. Modern transportation technology that allowed people to go from Boston to Harvard quickly. And what was along the way? Us. The bank that created the clock tower building built it specifically to be the tallest thing for miles around. You could see it from essentially the entire Charles River Basin because they were trying to attract people like a magnet to build in Kendall Square and do their business here. This is where Vannevar Bush founded Raytheon. At the same time, other wireless companies are moving in. This is the high tech of the time, radio. Yeah. Anyways, Arthur D. Little, next to MIT, builds his research palace, where he pioneers the technology management consulting sector. Before there was a McKinsey, a BCG, a Bain, there was ADL here next to MIT in what was soon to be known as $1 Million Research Row, co-located by the Institute to benefit from this talent magnetism. You see, it's part of what makes Kendall Square a hotspot for over a century. It's not a recent phenomenon. Alums from when Walker was president were by this time presidents of their companies. General Motors, General Electric, General Soup, all led by alums from the class of 1895, some quarter century later.
Did they used to know General Soup?
No, I made that up, but it's Campbell Soup. It should be. But there's General Foods and General Mills, wrong generals. Look at this newspaper article, Cambridge Chronicle, May 1923. Writes about the oldest maker of radio technology in the US is in this building, which was a storage warehouse originally for agricultural products in the late 1800s. Today still exists, the oldest existing building in Kendall Square, national landmark, protected status. But notice the advertisement on the article. Here's the actual scanned article here. Eyes of New England are focused upon Kendall Square, Cambridge, says Manufacturers National Bank, who built this clock tower building. This photograph, of course, taken before the looming Starkitecture was built over the clock tower. Yeah, alas. But in any case, the spin here is it was built explicitly to attract, and in the decade of the 20s, Kendall Square tripled in size. So this latest round of construction is not the first round of construction. Here are the three landmark buildings that still exist: the clock tower, the middle, and the Suffolk building. Notice also this structure here to the left. It's gone now, but what's important about this structure? The T is here. This is now the MIT Museum. This structure today is Innovation HQ for MIT. This is MIT's investment in an entire building worth of hotspot for student clubs, for programs to attract students to think about startups and commercialization and so forth, for the venture mentoring service that are volunteers helping a new generation, and the list goes on. This building was, by the way, the Suffolk Engraving Company originally. Then it became the founding home of Raytheon, born here on the second floor. And then it became the home of a chocolate, actually a candy factory called Fox Cross, which made the Charleston shoe. Yeah, and then MIT bought it. That building that I pointed out, that's now destroyed, was where Raytheon first made tubes. They started as American Appliance and abandoned that business to get into radio, because it was the thing of a century ago. And it was because of that capacity to make radio and electronics stuff that during World War II, when the Brits, this is Tizard, brought this cavity magnetron from the UK, this is what enables radar. But it was hugely costly to make and finicky and made bulky radar. So Raytheon's Percy Spencer figured out how to multiply manufacturing of improved tubes by nearly 1,000-fold, so making thousands per day instead of between 5 and 20. And this is the guy who discovered that the magnetron he was working on melted the candy bar in his coat pocket. You understand, that's a hazardous situation. But he had the insight, the serendipitous smarts, to realize that microwave radiation would heat food, which is why this radar range line of microwave ovens was created. Now, originally bulky stuff, but today it's the only modern appliance of the 20th century in the average kitchen, really. Maybe food processor and coffee machine, but the microwave oven. Now, where did it happen? Largely on this eastern edge of campus. Raytheon was here. And this is the Infinite Corridor. Here's where the Media Lab, where we are right now. So we're on the edge of that. Now, the red dots are biopharma businesses. So we're talking about an incredible concentration, 100 plus biopharma businesses within the Kendall square kilometer and near neighborhood. Historically, though, it was candy making. Here you see the map from the Historical Society with various candy factories and a few others. The last one still existing is what makes Junior Mints today, owned by Tootsie Roll Industries. And they're the last stop on the innovation trail. If you want to see a lot of this stuff, you can. Scott Kersner and colleagues created a trail from Boston. This is where Radio Shack was founded in the 1920s. Lots of other stuff. This is where Alexander Graham Bell had his workshop and made his first phone call from downstairs in the workshop, along telegraph lines to what's now an MIT-owned building here, number 2 on the list. Yeah, a building that's today biotech co-working space. All right, how did this happen? Bob Udary wrote a whole history. You should read it. This is what a map of Kendall Square looked like before they filled in most of the canal, which was the transportation technology of 2 centuries ago. Today, it only goes maybe 1/5 of the length that it's portrayed here. Everything else was filled in. The far left end, or northwestern end of that blue line, or Broad Canal, is what's today's Alexandria 1 Kendall. It's right south of where the Kendall Square Theater is. It's where the Cambridge Brewing Company has been for the last 35 years. And fascinating enough, it's one of the first adaptive reuse projects in the neighborhood. Everything else was clear cut. Almost all of what you see on this map has disappeared, except for a few historical structures that were preserved, renovated, etc. Now, just time-lapsing, the Boston Historical Commission did a lovely series of maps where they showed what was where we are now. So today, we have the MIT campus, and to the northeast of the MIT campus, Kendall Square. But in the beginning, it was tidal swamps, mudflats. And that didn't end until first the railroad embankment was made, and then later, what was in front of the railroad. So here you see early emergence of Central Square in Cambridge. The part that's MIT was not yet landfilled. And that only happened when you had first the railroad, which you see here cutting across the mudflats, and then later Davenport, famous actually Cambridge entrepreneur. He was the founder of the Davenport Railroad Manufactory. He was the guy who rivaled Pullman, invented the idea of putting a lane in the center of a rail car with seats on either side. Anyways, he sold that business and created the Cambridge Land Embankment Company. And that Land Embankment Company put in the seawall that is today's edge of Memorial Drive. And you see, because we fast forward through these maps, that it's landfill that became the space where MIT ultimately made its home. In the beginning, just to the northeast of MAS.552, but over time, it's now nearly 200 acres if you include not only the academic campus, but the MIT-owned business properties nearby. And over time, of course, not only does MIT flesh out, but the area that's near us, starting from being farms in the colonial era, becoming increasingly industrialized on the one hand, and residentialized beyond the industrial. Now,
If we look from where roughly Mass General Hospital is across the Charles River, you would have seen this. You see this Charles River Ironworks and most especially Edward Kendall and Sons. It's because of this factory location for making boilers. That's why we know Kendall Square by its name. The only remnant of that sprawling business is this Kendall boiler and tank, the facility which is, the painting on the wall is what's left. The innards are now something totally different. And this is on Binney and 3rd Street, which is actually an important historical location. The first mass custom medical devices business ever, planet-wide, was created just across the street from this building by a bunch of MIT mechanical engineers. Anyways, here we have the Davenport Railroad car manufactory. There he is in the upper right. He had the big idea of learning lessons from what happened in Havana, Cuba. This lovely esplanade along the waterfront with residential neighborhood behind it, and he said, I want to replicate that. So basically make a back bay-like neighborhood only on the opposite shore of the Charles River. That was his dream. And he poured all of his money, what he got from selling this railroad car manufacturer, he poured all that into these plans. Here you see early illustrations of what he had hoped to do. Here you can actually, if you squint closely, you see the bend in Mass Ave where ultimately on the right side of this image, 77 Mass Ave, MIT's main entrance, the dome, the smaller of the two dome buildings is created. But you also see something compelling, that Davenport's idea was to have streets akin to Back Bay, Newbury, Marlborough, those, only on this side it would be named after universities. So you have Amherst Street, Princeton Street, Wellesley Street, Radcliffe Street, and Vassar Street. And you recognize at least two of those three, the Vassar and Amherst streets still are there. Only Radcliffe and Wellesley and Princeton ended up becoming, in the modern MIT complex, Princeton Street is the Infinite Quarter, Wellesley Street is the outdoor pathway to the north of the Infinite Quarter, and then of course we have Vassar. There's not much left of what was then called Radcliffe Street. Even then, those patterns continue today. Here we have the planned map of the original MIT campus, where we are today. And if we zoom out, big picture, to the immediate post-World War II era, we're not yet physically as a building, here, but what is there are now MIT-owned buildings where the Department of Psychology, what's today Brain and Cognitive Science, were located. And to the upper right, just slightly northeast, you see the 3 prime buildings of the then very new Technology Square. That was the big development of the 1960s. And the other thing that you can see is that the canal is partly being filled in. It's not yet fully filled in, but it's getting there. And it's on that canal to the right of the red circle that we have the development of what became the Volpe project.
Notice the patchwork quilt of business parks surrounding MIT, including Tech Square, the first. The rest happened because this first one ended up ultimately being successful. This is today's Technology Square. This was built with no ground floor retail. Very brutalist, imposing place, not friendly to anybody, including the employees working there. But today, of course, it's where Max is. It's where we've got restaurants on the ground floor, Catalyst, the 7-Eleven on the corner over here, and more. Here is maybe Kendall Square of a decade ago. Looks pretty complete, but notice the tall construction happening now is this parking garage being turned into a research tower and the tallest building in Cambridge, a residential tower. It's next to the now Akamai Tower, which is huge. This old MIT Coop building right here, next to it, the small one, is now the tall Googleplex. What was a parking lot here is now the MIT Museum building, okay? So that's a recent but not contemporary photo. However, at the time of the Vietnam War, this is what the place looked like. The only things that you see in the subsequent photograph that are also here are these 3 buildings. Almost everything else is clear cut. This is what Jane Jacobs decried, this clear cutting, using federal law to bully hundreds of employers and thousands of employees out of a neighborhood. It also happened across the river in what's called the West End, same kind of clear cutting. But there were interesting exceptions. So this is the land before clear cutting. The canal continued. This is what was going on at Stanford at that time. This is MIT alum Fred Terman, who was Vannevar Bush's student, who later led Stanford, and Hewlett and Packard were his students. So he has Greenfield to work with to create the Stanford Research Park on the Stanford campus. Now here's the exception to the clear cutting, and it's case study number 1. David Clem had been an alumnus, Cambridge City Councilor, had been part of the clear cutting with Tech Square, but he thought we could do better. And he took this old Boston woven hose factory and did the first Cambridge adaptive reuse on it. This photograph of today's one Kendall is taken from the roof of this building. So you can see we're looking at that tower, buildings that were essentially gut renovated but not destroyed. And here is the heart of Kendall Square. Here's the Marriott Hotel about to be developed. Here's the Raytheon founding home, today's Innovation HQ, and the hotspot of the time for a better part of a century, the F&T Diner. That's actually where everybody mixed, because this was already a century ago a technology hotspot. That's why this was founded in 1924. Yeah. Notice they're extending the underground system by 50%, adding 2 cars to the 4 original Red Line cars. Cut and cover, here's the extension, here's the new entrance. Whoosh, away goes the F&T to be replaced for the better part of 30 years by a parking lot. Yeah, across the way, kitty corner, is one of the oldest modern buildings in Kendall. It's today MIT owned. It's where the Cambridge Innovation Center houses over 500 startups and emerging growth companies. But historically, it's where John Reed, our alum who ran Citibank, created the ATM. It's where companies like ThingMagic and HubSpot were born. It's where business process offshoring was founded by Sloan alum Narendra Patney. Yeah, the list goes on. These todays are the big owners. Alexandria, 1 million or 2 million square meters of space in these 4 campuses just to the northeast of us. The actual original developer is MIT alum Ed Lindy's Boston Properties, which is everything surrounding the Marriott building with red brick, including the Google and Akamai complex, the glass boxes of today. And this is what Dave Clem also built, something he sold to Biomed Realty Trust for a couple $100 million, today worth tens of billions of dollars. And it's the stuff on the eastern side of 3rd Street, so north of MIT's 1 Broadway. And here's MIT's 5 buildings, a 100,000 square meter, $1 billion development project. 4 of the 5 have been built. This one is the old Eastgate dormitory location. It's under construction. And what's the latest? MIT just finished the Reagan Institute in the last available spot on Main Street towards Harvard. And as of a month ago, MIT sold the MIT-owned space where the MIT engine is located to Biomed Realty Trust for $1/3 billion. So the action is still happening. What's next? Probably something on Volpe, maybe some other stuff in the meantime, but this is likely to be fully redeveloped in the upcoming year or 2. And we'll see. We're here in the IMP building. This is northeast. So this is 3rd Street right here. Here's the Marriott Hotel. This is minus this corner, which is already built for the government. This is the only remaining open space, unless you tear down existing stuff, which is happening, right? Remember, this building, these buildings are all gone. This is now towers, and more are coming. So, along the way, I've skipped over lots of neighborhood controversy, lots of attempts to halt or slow this down, lots of broken opinions, lots of booms and busts, people fire selling things to make a little bit of money. This is one of my favorite sites just because it shows the timeline. We don't have time today, but if you go to this visualizations at Sasaki for the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority, they show this dynamically animated over time, so you can see what's developed when and for what purpose. In the Kendall wing of the MIT campus, it includes part of campus, but also the largely industrial zone between us and the residential neighborhoods beyond. Yeah, so in conclusion, it's a more than one kind of capital, riffing and feeding upon the other kinds of capital. Right? So money and ideas and talent matter, financial, intellectual, and human capital. But when they're compressed, they're densely co-located in an aesthetically interesting enough fashion with places to build things, with power tools, physical infrastructure, both structures as well as transit and beyond. What you end up with is the Allen's law incarnate. Tom Allen at Sloan was the first to quantify that the power and effectiveness of communication on this axis is an exponential decaying function of distance from one another. Further you are apart, the order of magnitude less likely it is that you will have fruitful connections. Now, he later wanted to modify it in a digital era, but alas, the electronic network is no real replacement for physical co-location. It's just not yet the same. And who knows whether we can invent a better future, but it's still powerful to be co-located, to be in an epicenter, not in a distribution. And the Media Lab's motto in the beginning mimicked MIT's motto of mind in hand by having demo or die. Now that modified to deploy or die, and then deploy, and then we're dying. But I think that really it's about iterate and escalate and recombinate. So keep at it, do something compelling to push it out or reboot altogether, and then take your ideas and remix them with the ideas of others, which is the power of co-location and cross connections, this recombination outlook. And this idea of doing something that's impactful, otherwise you're irrelevant, is a bold one. But I actually think it's an important one to bring up, because if you don't have the ambition, you probably won't get to where you're going or to a place that's interesting to go. So there it is. That's all I had to say. Hope that was useful.